This is going to be the first of 3 offseason top 10 rankings for the 2025 college football season. The second one will happen after spring ball and after the spring transfer portal window. And then the third one will happen in the summer before the season starts. Number 10, Arizona State. There's a lot to like here. Let's start with Sam Leavitt, who's back. 24 touchdowns to 6 picks last year. Losing Cam Scadaboo, obviously a huge loss for them, but they're going to supplement that by bringing in the Army running back transfer who had 1,000 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns last year. Cam Scadaboo obviously was the do-it-all kind of guy for them, so that's a huge loss. You're not going to get that back completely, but you can supplement that, and I feel a little bit better about it because they utilized the portal to bring in a guy that's going to be kind of plug and play. They also have Jordan Tyson coming back, over 1,000 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns last year. PFF is recognizing him as a top 3 receiver in the 2025 college football season. I think the questions with Arizona State is, number 1, with Sam Leavitt, is he going to take the next step as a passer, especially with the Scadaboo loss? I think you have to ask him to do a little bit more, especially when you pair that with Tyson coming back. Another question is for Kenny Dillingham. He's a young coach. He's a good coach, but being a young coach, there's going to be speed bumps along the way, no matter how good you are. Last year, Arizona State, everyone picked them to lose. No one picked them to make the playoff and go on this run late in the season, win the Big 12, make the playoff. They were playing with house money. They could play loose. They had nothing to lose. Now, all of a sudden, this year, you have heightened expectations. And that doesn't mean he can't handle it. He's a good young coach. But sometimes, as a young coach, especially at a program like ASU, where it's not like they're Ohio State or Georgia, where they just reload players, this kind of year can be tricky to handle. Number 9, Illinois. I really hope I don't regret this, and maybe I'm going to be way off with this and look back and regret doing this, but I think Illinois should be in the playoff hunt, and I actually feel pretty good about them the more I looked into them and the more I did my research. So they won 10 games last year. That's the first time they've had a 10-win season since 2001. They return a ton of production coming back. 24/7 Sports has 18 starters coming back. 18 starters from the Citrus Bowl that they won and won their 10th game last year. 18 of those guys are coming back. Luke Altmaier returns. All 5 offensive line starters return. They have a ton of production coming back from the running backs, defensively, linebacker, the 2 deep. All in all, 18 guys coming back. That's a ton of production returning to Illinois, coming off a team that won a bowl game and won 10 games. I think we need to be on the lookout for Luke to have a big year. 2,700 passing yards last year, 22-6 touchdown to interception ratio. But most importantly with Luke, if you dig into the numbers a little bit, his interception percentage dropped from 5.9% to 3.7% 2 seasons ago to 1.7% last year. So he's pushing the ball downfield a lot more while throwing less interceptions, which is exactly what we want to see out of our quarterback. And on top of all of this, their schedule is very manageable, and it sets up pretty nicely for them. They go to Indiana early, but they get USC at home. They get Ohio State at home. They go to Washington and to Wisconsin, and those games can be tricky. But overall, I would be surprised if they did not make a push for a playoff spot. Number 8, South Carolina. It feels like they have the chance to do something here, and maybe this is too high. I feel like 10, 9, 8 in my rankings can kind of go either way here. But 9-4 last year, Sellers is back, Dylan Stewart is back. He's still just a baby, but as a freshman last year, my God, Dylan Stewart, 6.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. You could feel him. You could feel his presence. Now imagine him in year 2, thinking ahead to year 3 as well. This guy's going to be a monster. And Dylan Stewart, this is the kind of guy that's going to help you win games. Shane Beamer hadn't won 9 games in a season before last year. It's good to see that progression. Now it's kind of similar to Kenny Dillingham in a sense. And I understand the programs are in different spots and didn't have the same seasons. But can Shane build off this? Or is this going to be a down year? This is kind of the reload, rebuild discussion, right? What position is South Carolina in? And as teams get their money in order, maybe they can reload more and rebuild less. I think the nice thing about South Carolina and the best thing they have going for them right now is that they're clearly talented if you look at their roster, but it doesn't feel like there's a ton of pressure on them to perform and have this fantastic season the way I feel that there's pressure on a lot of other programs in this top 10. I hope I don't come back and regret this one either with South Carolina at 8, but I feel the talent. I love a guy like Dylan Stewart. I think he's really going to help them win some games. Number 7, Clemson. There's a lot to like here with Clemson, but I'm going to start off with a negative thing here because I don't have a ton of trust in Dabo to win another national championship at Clemson. I don't think that, that's not a hot take. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Since getting blown out by Ohio State in the playoff game in the 2020 season, Clemson's gone 10-3, 11-3, 9-4, and 10-4. The positive side of things, they won the ACC last year. That's great. The ACC isn't that strong, but still winning the conference and being able to finish the season on a relatively good note is good for that program. I also like Cade Klubnik coming back for another year. Low key, and let's be honest about this, had a pretty good 2024 season. 3,600 passing yards, 43 total touchdowns to only 6 picks. That's a hell of a year for Cade Klubnik, and honestly, I don't think that was talked about enough. Where he could improve, he only completed 63% of his passes. If he can start pushing that up to 70%, I think he could be really good and have an awesome year. Also, Clemson might be throwing this football around a little bit because we got Garrett Riley, offensive coordinator, still a young, up-and-coming, people know about him now, but he's such a hot name in the offensive coordinator market, so Clemson likes him. They also got Allen as defensive coordinator from Penn State, the former Indiana head coach. So I like the quarterback. I like the coordinators. I like the conference they're in. So that's why I have Clemson here at 7. Let's see if Dabo can do something with this, with your quarterback and with your coordinators. Are they going to win a national championship? I would probably guess not at this point, but this Clemson team could be pretty good. Number 6, Georgia. I think I feel okay about the Bulldogs. I think there are still some questions about Gunnar Stockton, and that's fair. We haven't seen enough of him yet. Got some valuable reps last year, but what we're going to like about the Georgia passing game is you give him a weapon like Zachariah Branch, who they took in the transfer portal out of USC. That's going to be really nice for Gunnar Stockton and for that Georgia offense. And I think taking Zachariah Branch in the portal was one of the quietest offseason moves this college football season. That's just something kind of like with Clemson and Cade Klubnik having a great year. This move to get Zachariah Branch wasn't talked about enough. They also got Noah Thomas out of Texas A&M. He had 8 receiving touchdowns last year. So they're trying to find a way to be a little bit more explosive on offense and their skill positions on the outside. Georgia didn't really have that last year. And even with Brock Bowers was really, really good and did a lot for them in the pass game. But they've been missing these take the top off the defense, explosive wide receivers. Now they have that, and it's going to be a lot of fun to see Zachariah Branch. If you go back to last season, Georgia clearly felt vulnerable that year. I mean, obviously they lost a few games, but also you look at games like Kentucky where they could have or maybe should have lost that game. This wasn't the same Georgia as we saw the previous seasons. The good news is they still won the SEC, which is not easy to do, and they still beat Texas twice. I think last year, if I could summarize it, I think they had a pretty high ceiling, but also a pretty low floor. And I think we saw them playing closer to that floor, especially during the second half of that season, than we saw them playing up to that ceiling. But overall, I have to trust Kirby. I think he's a top 3 coach in college football. I think there's a lot of people that would still say he's the best coach in the country. So I have no reason not to trust Kirby. Georgia is number 6. Number 5, Oregon. They'll have to replace some key pieces, but I think they have some things figured out. They're still going to be a threat this year. They're doing a very good job in their recruiting. Their transfer portal acquisitions have always been very good to them. They have their NIL figured out. They got Phil Knight and Nike in their back pocket. They're going to need some young guys to step up, and specifically I think about receiver. They have the highly rated freshman Decorian Moore, 5-star, number 1 ranked receiver in his class. He's probably going to play, and he's going to have a significant role. If you're an Oregon fan, I think overall you have to feel pretty good about Dan Lanning. And the last thing you want to see is like if Alabama or a program like LSU just tanks and has an awful year, the first person they're probably going to call is Dan Lanning. So you want to hang on to him. He's still a young coach, up and coming, but last year was a great season and great progression for Dan Lanning in his program at Oregon. Beating Ohio State was a monumental win, something that Dan Lanning needed to show that he could do. The playoff loss to Ohio State, that sucked. They got caught on a bad day, and Ohio State super team that we were waiting on and didn't see in the regular season that finally showed up, and they just destroyed everyone except for Texas in the college football playoff. So it's not like you can just disregard that playoff loss if you're an Oregon fan, but going 13-0, winning the Big Ten, beating Ohio State in the regular season, there's a lot to like with Dan Lanning. I think you're fine and you feel pretty good if you have him as the head coach of your program. Number 4, Notre Dame. I love the direction that Marcus Freeman's taking this program. I think everyone likes him as a head coach, whether or not you're a Notre Dame fan. It feels like if you made a list of programs and you go, you know what, every program on this list is a program that I think could pop, not go on a dynasty, but is going to go on a run and have consecutive or 3 or 4 really, really good seasons. I think Notre Dame is on that list. 2025 schedule is pretty favorable for them. It looks like they're going to be favored in every single game. And I think the general consensus is that it's probably going to be CJ Carr's job to lose at quarterback. You're bringing back Jeremiah Love, one of, if not the best running back in the country coming back. So you love that. I'm also very confident with the offensive line. I know there were injuries last year. They lost some guys to the portal. But even with all the injuries and guys that were banged up last year, the offensive line still played pretty well throughout the season. So when those things happen, I think you fall back on the head coach, and credit goes back to the head coach. You have a lot of confidence in Marcus Freeman. You like what he was able to do this last year. Big win to start the season against Texas A&M. You lose a horrible game to Northern Illinois, and then you just rattle off wins up until the national championship game. Great season for Marcus Freeman. I love the direction Notre Dame's going. Number 3, Penn State. This is going to be a long one because there's a lot to discuss here with Penn State. They're bringing back a lot of pieces, just like Michigan did 2 years ago and just like Ohio State did last year. They're not bringing back quite as much, and especially if you look at Ohio State, if you compare what Penn State's doing this year and Ohio State last year, they're not bringing back quite as much production. They're still losing Abdul Carter. They're losing Tyler Warren, but look who's coming back. Drew Aller, Katron Allen, and Nick Singleton, denied Dennis Sutton, who had 8 sacks last year. Can he take the next step defensively? Can he be a 10, 12 sack kind of guy? There's questions at receiver. Obviously, the skill players on the outside at receiver, I mean, they haven't been explosive. They haven't been threats at all. There was only one receiver last year that had over 500 receiving yards. And I know they had turnover in that room, so they brought in some new pieces. Schedule-wise, I mean, their non-conference is a joke. Nevada, FIU, Villanova, but then they open Big Ten play with Oregon at home, so that's going to be a quick wake-up call to see how good they really are. But then past that, they have Ohio State in Columbus November 1st, and then really that's it, I think. I mean, we'll see how Nebraska is. I'm not too worried about them being a threat, but this is a pretty nice schedule for Penn State. Overall, does it remind you of Michigan 2 years ago and Ohio State last year? Yes, because of guys that are choosing to come back when they could go pro. It's not to the same extent as those two programs, but that kind of feels like the recipe to win a national championship right now. In the world with NIL, where you can pay players to return and incentivize them to come back for one more year, run it back. Michigan did that. Ohio State did that. Now Penn State's trying to do that this year. Now, we can't talk about 2025 Penn State without talking about Jim Knowles leaving Ohio State for Penn State. This was a great move by James Franklin. So Tim Allen leaves and goes to be the defensive coordinator for Clemson. Penn State was in the position where it's like, look, we have to replace a coordinator. We're going to go out there and we're going to get the best possible coach, which was Jim Knowles, the DC at Ohio State. Jim Knowles leaving Ohio State was interesting. I think a lot of us thought that he wasn't going to finish his career at Ohio State. It kind of makes sense, I guess, in retrospect, that he was looking to leave. And I think there's a combination of factors why he would leave Columbus for Happy Valley. Part of it is he's returning home. That's his home state. In the recent interviews, or maybe not interviews, but the recent clips where he's talking to the Penn State team, he basically implied that he was a Penn State fan growing up. I don't know how much that really played a factor in it, but coming home could be a factor. He's obviously getting a ton of money. It's a big pay bump. He's the highest paid DC in college football, making over $3 million a year. Money talks. There was also some drama with the Ohio State coaching staff. The defensive line coach, Larry Johnson, and Jim Knowles never really agreed on scheme and what the defensive front should look like. I also think, not that he had a bad relationship with Ryan Day, but Ryan Day had to take time after the Oregon loss in the regular season. He had to take time and spend that with the defense on fixing that because the defense got absolutely torched in Eugene. And maybe that rubbed Jim Knowles the wrong way a little bit. And again, not that it's a negative thing on their relationship, but Jim Knowles was brought in. Ryan Day would always said, I'm bringing in the head coach of the defense. It's going to be your defense. You can kind of do what you want. And if Ryan Day is needing to step in and maybe have the veto power on certain things because the defense changed and was for the better in the second half of the season, maybe that combined with the Larry Johnson drama thing, all of these factors could lead to Jim Knowles leaving for Penn State. There's still questions about James Franklin and Drew Aller on the biggest stages. The good news for James Franklin is that loss in the semifinal to Notre Dame. I don't think you can pin that loss on James Franklin. There's lots of big games you can point to with James Franklin at Penn State and go, look, this is the reason why we lost. James Franklin did this, James Franklin did this, didn't do that. It kind of felt like coaching failure in spots with James Franklin. Against Notre Dame, I don't think you could really say that about James. I do think there's still questions about Drew Aller. I know this last offseason, a lot of people were waiting on him to take that next step. This year, people are saying the same thing. I mean, that's why he came back for another year. Maybe he wasn't quite ready for the NFL draft, but also you want to come back and try to win a championship or something for your team. Drew Aller and James Franklin, there's questions about both those guys in the biggest spots on the biggest stages. We need to see some answers to those questions. I think we're getting somewhere with James Franklin. I don't know if we're there yet with Drew Aller. Number 2, Ohio State. They're losing so many players to the NFL draft. We knew this, though. All these guys came back for one more year to win a national championship, and then they were going to go pro. The best pieces on the offensive line are gone. The running back duo is gone. Will Howard is gone. The entire starting defensive line is gone. Cody Simon is gone. Lathan Ransom is gone. The good news is, and why they're so high up on this list, is one, they have a national championship winning coach in Ryan Day. And two, they have the best offensive player in the country returning, Jeremiah Smith, and the best defensive player in the country returning, Caleb Downs. So even if you're losing a ton of production, in which they are, that's a hell of a start in your championship defense. Julian Sayin is going to be the presumed starter at quarterback. Obviously, he's going to fight it out in the offseason here, but that's who we think is going to be the starter, the former 5-star. The staff really likes James Peoples at running back, and he flashed a little bit this last year. I think the schedule is okay. The big games, obviously, the home opener at home against Texas, Penn State at home, and then at Michigan. They also play at Washington and at Illinois. So those games are going to mean something, and honestly, it could be quite difficult, especially if I think Illinois could be quite good. I don't feel good about Ohio State going 12-0. You can't feel good about that. But what we saw this year is that you only have to win 10 games to get in. So I don't know if Julian Sayin is going to be ready for the moment week 1 against Texas in such a big game and such a big matchup. Obviously, it's way too early to tell, and we don't even know if Julian's the starter at this point. I'm assuming he's going to be. But if they drop a game like that, then they drop a game against a Penn State or Michigan, I think 10 wins is probably the most realistic outlook for 2025 Ohio State. But all things considered, I think Ohio State's set up in a pretty good position considering how many pieces and how much production they're losing. Number 1, Texas. This is going to be a lot of people's number 1 ranked team, and rightfully so. Arch Manning is going to be the guy at quarterback. I think the most important thing that Texas did last year was give Arch valuable in-game reps. You never want your starting quarterback to get hurt, but when Quinn Ewers did get hurt, it was kind of a blessing because got a few starts under his belt. Looked pretty good, honestly. He finished the year with nearly 1,000 passing yards, 9 passing touchdowns, had 2 picks, 87.5 QBR. Also has the dual threat element, had 4 rushing touchdowns last year. So I think Texas has him in the perfect position that's going to be ready to go. Just like we talked about with Ohio State, Texas is going to be on the road at Ohio State and Columbus. That's a hell of a start for Arch Manning, so we'll see how he handles that. Defensively, there's a lot to like. We like Colin Simmons. I think Texas feels ready for the moment right now in college football. Arch Manning is ready to go. I think they have the pieces defensively to make a big run here. And I think if you can point to any team in college football right now and say that's the team that's ready for the moment right now, I think that's Texas. They have a quarterback in waiting, ready to go. I think a lot of Texas fans were kind of over Quinn Ewers. I mean, you were kind of in the gray area with them where he was good enough to get you to the playoff, but probably not good enough to get you up the top. I think the fans have been ready for Arch Manning, and I think they're going to have him ready to go in 2025.